Welcome back to another episode of Offbeat Adventures. We're standing here once again on the grade of the former Canadian Northern Railway and later Canadian National Railways, Dorion and then subsequently Kinghorn Subdivision. We are just to the north of community of Nipigon, Ontario. We're alongside the big Nipigon River, which is just to our west. We're picking up right where we left off from a previous hike, which we did last fall, which goes that way up towards the station at Cameron Falls. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going from this spot here right up on this very, very high embankment. Again, you can see the river in the distance. There's a big culvert, big concrete culvert at the bottom, which we checked out in the previous episode. And so we're going to be working our way down to just past Parmachene Station, which is about just over 3 miles, 3.3 miles away. So this is a redo. We previously did this section almost 3 years ago. So we did this in September of 2020. It is now May of 2023. We do have the trailer with us today. We had to take a long detour to get here. That's a long story for another time. We've had a very interesting hike. It's just after 11 o'clock. We should have been here. We should have been starting the video like, I don't know, 45 minutes ago, maybe more. It's just been kind of very, very interesting. This is our fourth hike of the year. We've had a very, very bad spring. And because of that, we were late getting started. And that bad spring, winter, whatever you want to call it, has really, really affected the first part of this hike. There's several grown-in sections from here to our really big feature on this section, which is crossing the Nipigon River. You can see the issue here. You can see all of these alders and other trees. Obviously, there was some sort of wet snowfall, either at the beginning of, probably at the beginning of the winter. And you can see it's bended all of these trees over the grade. And there's like 5 sections like this. Oops. And so what's happened is I've had to hack my way through with my knife, and it's just taken an unbelievable amount of time, on top of the fact that, again, we had to detour to get in here. So that's why I have the trailer, because I had to throw Luna in the trailer, so just to cut back on the amount of walking she had to do. And so I'm just exhausted. 4 miles of biking before we started the hike, and then all of this cutting, and I had to do all the cutting by hand, basically with my knife. Thank God I sharpened it before we came hiking. I sharpened it actually. Today's Sunday. I sharpened it on Friday night, which is very fortuitous because I needed a really, really sharp knife. Unfortunately, I've accumulated some battle scars, bloody knuckle, and then I basically developed a blister here, and then it tore the blister, so I have a hard time gripping the handlebar on my bike. It's not like we can bike a lot in this first section anyway, just because there's just so much growth on here that it's very difficult to get by. And again, this is the issue with these rail lines that are no longer in service. You get all this growth like this. Okay, so while we have a minute here, we can start our usual history lesson. So this line was constructed by Canadian Northern Railway between 1911 and 1914. It was going to be one of the final pieces in Canadian Northern's transcontinental ambitions. The Canadian Northern Company got their start in Manitoba way back in 1896, bought up some charters and old lines and things like that. Their first big project was the construction of a line between the then city of Port Arthur, which is now Thunder Bay, and Winnipeg. And that line was opened in 1902. And then after that, they began constructing lines all throughout the prairies. Canadian Northern sort of became synonymous with the prairies, and the northern part with all their branch lines and basically serving all the sort of agricultural areas. Again, you can just see how brutal this is. Obviously, nobody has come through here yet this spring. So around that same time, Canadian Northern began constructing lines around the Toronto area, eventually reaching north up into Sudbury. And around that time as well, Canadian Northern began to realize that for the company to be profitable long term, they would require a transcontinental connection. Now, Canadian Northern wasn't particularly keen on building that transcontinental line because it was there were sections of it that were going to be very difficult and therefore very expensive. You know, for example, the mountains of British Columbia, and then this section here. And so we have our first stopping point here. We do have a culvert. There's lots of culverts on this section here. So this one is 119.32, 119.32, I think. It's hard to read some of them. There's a grouse up on the grade there. I do apologize. We're heading south. We're going right into the sun. And so you're going to get some glare. There's nothing much I can do about that. Does she see it? I have to get off anyway because I have to cross these trees that I cut down. Bridge isn't moving. There it goes. Okay. So the Canadian Northern Company eventually was forced to build this section, even though they didn't want to. They tried, you know, some different alternatives, including a running rights agreement with Canadian Pacific Railway. But they were forced to build, and construction began again in the latter half of 1911, was completed in 1914. So New Year's Day 1914, the last spike was driven. I'm going to try to keep my head down a bit. There's a bit of high cloud, but it's still pretty bright. So here you can see marker for the culvert. This one's easy to read, 119.36. So that is the mileage on the Kinghorn, the original, sorry, the latter entity, latter iteration of this line. And so that would be 69.66 on the original lines. Speaking of the original lines, so the last spike was driven on New Year's Day 1914, and the line opened for traffic in 1950. Now, around the time that transcontinental service began in 1914, the Canadian Northern was starting to run into some serious financial difficulties. Basically construction costs, including building through this area and then building through the mountains of British Columbia. Here you have another culvert. This one is 119.42. So building construction costs, you know, the line from here from Ruel to Port Arthur, and then some of the financial pressures of World War I. So the Canadian Northern was starting to experience financial difficulties, and by 1917 the company was basically bankrupt and had to be taken over by the Canadian government. And so a year later, in 1918, right at the end of 1918, Canadian Northern was merged, amalgamated, whatever descriptor that you want to use, with a bunch of other Canadian government owned bankrupt lines. Here's another culvert. This one, that one, the marker is illegible, you can't read it. And that merger formed Canadian National Railways. And the nationalization process took until 1923 because it had to essentially absorb the Grand Trunk lines. And so in 1923, the name of this line changed. It had originally been the Nipigon Subdivision of Canadian Northern Railway, and it became the Dorion Subdivision of Canadian National Railways. And it continued as the Dorion Subdivision until 1960, when there was a major reorganization in CN, As part of that reorganization, the Dorion subdivision was merged with the more easterly Kinghorn subdivision. And so it created a line from Long Lac to Port Arthur, 195 miles long, and the line became known as the Kinghorn subdivision. And the Kinghorn continued operating until 2005, when CN decided to discontinue service and the rails were pulled up between 2008 and 2010. So this is yet more of my handiwork. Basically everything that you see that's cut here, I cut by hand with my knife, and again with my blister and my bloody knuckle and my bad shoulder. Again, it's spring, so today's the 21st of May. Again, we've had a late spring because of some of the weather in April, and so everything's kind of behind. The leaves are just starting to come out, which is perfect, so it allows us to kind of see things. But there's pollen everywhere. I don't know if you can see the screen on my phone. There's pollen all over my screen. There's pollen all over my bike. My helmet is black, and it looks like it's camouflage because it's got pollen smeared all over it. So again, this is just one of these brutal sections. Again, just the issue with this line, obviously the last train ran in 2005, so that was 18 years ago, and you know, obviously there's no maintenance or anything being done on this. People do ride their all-terrain vehicles, and usually they kind of keep the brush back, but obviously, again, as I mentioned, probably nobody has been through this section yet this year, and so it was up to me to do all the hacking and chopping, and I am just absolutely gassed doing that. It was funny, there was a video I posted over the winter on because I post them on my YouTube channel and then they go on social media, and this gentleman basically suggested, hey, you know, you should, and obviously with good intentions, you should bring a chainsaw with you to cut the trees. You know, I have the trailer with me today, but you know, not really anywhere I can put the chainsaw. Okay, we're going to hold up for a second. We previously filmed this next section because there's a rock cut here, and so I'm going to take you through the rock cut, and then we're going to resume on the other side. All right, so I'm going to take you through this one rock cut section here on this portion of the line, and everything sort of peters out a little bit further back, closer to Cameron Falls. So here you can see the rock cut is on both sides of the grade. It's about, at least on the west side, I don't know, 15 feet, 17 feet, something like that, maybe even more, maybe 20 up to the top there. The sun is just peeking through the trees, so getting goofy shadows here. And here the rock cut starts to peter out a bit. Kind of turns into a little bit more of just a cut. Okay, so let's jump back up on the bike here and resume the journey.